Shalom, all praises, blessings, glory, and honors to Yahweh Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Bahashem, Racha Kodash. Double honors to my elder apostles and bishop elders of Great Millstone, who have taught me this truth, as well of men of like mind. Shalom wa chasad, which means peace and mercy, to the elect of the nation of Israel, whom you so-called Negroes, Latinos, Native American Indians, and Israelite foreigners of the seed line of our forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, whom are scattered here in America, which is Babylon the Great, and abroad. And to you I say, Shalom and Yahweh Bahashem, Yahweh Shai Ratazah. This lesson is edifying. Deuteronomy 32, verse 39. See now that I, even I, am He, and there is no God with me. I kill, and I make alive. I wound, and I heal. Neither is there any that can deliver out of my hand. If I lift up my hands to heaven and say, I live forever. In the news. And this is something that I'd found very interesting, but not surprising, considering that we are in the season of, according to Esau's, which is calendar, Yule, and where they celebrate Samhain, which is so-called Halloween. And we understand that on so-called Halloween, Esau, Edom, sacrifices many, especially children. Now, a recent event had happened in Korea, where over 100 people had died in a freak accident. And this is from the BBC News. Itaewon crush, shock and anger as Seoul grieves for its young. Now, I'm not going to read this entire article. I'm just simply going to read the part that mentions the amount of people that had died so that I can move on to the next article that also exhibits not only the times that we are living in, but also the judgments of Yahweh Bahashem, Yahweh Shai first and foremost. On a bright and cloudy October afternoon, Lee In-suk marched into a grassy field in the middle of Seoul, sat down and began to wail. Clutching a handmade sign that said, "I'm so sorry, guys," she directed her piercing cries at a large stage covered in flowers. A public altar, interesting, honoring the many young lives lost in Saturday night's Itaewon crush. She was one of thousands of Seoul residents who flocked to the altar at City Hall on Monday as the capital struggled with grief and anger over the disaster. And that was one gigantic sacrifice, the worst the country has seen since 2014, when the Seoul ferry sank, killing more than 300,000. Seoul Korean ferry disaster. Seoul remains not human. Remains found on the raised Seoul ferry that were thought to come from one of the disaster's missing victims or from animals, South Korea officials say. The National Forensic Service conducted tests and confirmed that as animal bone fragments, the Maritime Ministry said. The CO sank off Jindo Island on 16th of April 2014, killing 304 people, almost all of them children. Almost all, how very interesting, of them children. And during the season of Samhain, again, children are the usual targets and victims. And that concludes the article. And that is an example of great judgment, ultimately, and first and foremost from Yahweh Bahashem Yahushai. In other news, India in shock as bridge disaster toll rises to 141. There was also, and had also been reports that there was a flood in Nigeria where millions are left in dire straits. Straits meaning position of difficulties. Summary. Dozens have died after a pedestrian suspension bridge collapsed in India's Gujarat state on Sunday. The bridge had been reopened just days earlier after repairs. Reports say hundreds of people were on the bridge to perform rituals for a religious festival. Oh, very interesting. At least 177 people have been rescued so far, and search operations are underway for others who are missing. The Gujarat government has ordered an investigation into the incident. And I'll stop right there. Now, all of these freak accidents and freak incidents could have happened at any other time, even earlier during this month. But for some reason, Yahweh Bahashem Yahushai had these things happen, especially through Esau, Edom on the left hand, around this period of the celebration of Samhain, which is so-called Halloween, which is no coincidence. And ultimately, again, all judgment comes from Yahweh Bahashem Yahushai, because as is written here in Deuteronomy chapter 32, because, see, people at times they try to say, oh, well, oh my gosh, that's crazy. That's, it's sad that they died. It's this, it's that. But remember that all judgments comes from Yahweh Bahashem Yahushai. And even though we might mention Esau does this or Esau does that, ultimately it all comes from Yahweh Bahashem Yahushai. All credit, all glories, all honors, and all blessings goes to Yahweh Bahashem Yahushai, Bahashem Racha Kodash, man. Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 39. See now that I, even I, am he, and that is referring to Yahweh. And his name means he is, he exists. Yahweh. Yah means he, Hawa means exist or is. Yahweh. And his son's name is Yahushai. Yah means he, Yahushai means delivers or saves. Yahushai. And there is no power with me. I kill and I make alive. I wound and I heal. Neither is there any that can deliver out of my hand. So there is no escaping out of the hands of Yahweh, Bahashem Yahushai. 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 6. The Lord Yahweh killeth and maketh alive. He bringeth down to the grave and bringeth up. So the Lord is the one that brings death, miseries, destruction, and life. and no one else. The issues of life and death belongs to and cometh from Yahweh, Bahashem Yahweh Shai. The Lord Yahweh maketh poor and maketh rich. He bringeth low and lifteth up. Okay, so the Lord is one that brings all these different estates and calamities upon men and upon the world. Verse 40 of Deuteronomy chapter 32. For I lift up my hand to heaven and say, I live forever. And the Lord's, one of his title, Yahweh, is the Ancient of Days. He is more ancient than time itself. Okay? So a lot of interesting things, a lot of big judgments. Rab, which means great, Mashapatyam, which means judgments in the Hebrew, have been going out as of late. See that? Somalia twin car bomb blast kills 100 in capital 1 day ago. Twin car bomb explosions near a busy junction in Somalia's capital, Mogadishu, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, killed at least 100 people. President Hassan Sheikh Mohammed says, and the majority of those Somalians, a lot of them are Hamites, and you have Jakes amongst them. Okay, you have Jakes amongst them, but you have a lot of Hamites in those parts, in those lands. And let's not forget, in Sudan, that's where them real Egyptians, them tall, jet black Hamites, those are the Egyptians, the ones that had us in slavery in Egypt. Those over there in Sudan. Okay, now you got Jakes amongst them. Because remember, Jake is scattered all over. Jake is just short for Jacob, which represents Israel, for those of you that are new. Okay. Among the victims who were massacred were mothers with their children. Here goes children again, in their arms. The AFP news agency quotes the president as saying, he appealed for international medical help, to deal with the 300 injured. The president blamed the Al-Shabaab militant group for Saturday's attack, which targeted the education ministry. So I'll conclude reading the article there, as the point had been read. A lot of you Israelites that are celebrating Samhain, you have not a clue what you're celebrating. So this morning we learned that 100 people had died in a car bomb in Somalia, 141 plus from a bridge disaster in India, and over 300 as of recently in South Korea's freak accident. And those are all judgments from Yahweh Bashem Yahweh Shai. Okay? So that concludes the news from the BBC. Now, in other news from the CNN, the Fed may have to blow up the economy to get inflation under control. Now, what does this mean? Now, while this commercial this ad plays, I'll read the first paragraph. The Federal Reserve is most likely going to raise interest rates by 0.75 of a percentage point again on Wednesday. It's fourth
Early
straight
in the book, you list potential triggers of the next economic shock. One is, quote, a surge in inflation, forcing central banks to tighten policy in a draconian way, leading to an unsustainable rise in interest rates. So we've heard over and over again the Federal Reserve is being too aggressive right now. Is it being too aggressive, the Fed?
It is not, in the sense that inflation now is out of control. And if the Fed doesn't tighten much more, the risk is like in the 70s of a de-anchoring.
Now remember, as of last week, it had been reported that the American economy had expanded. Okay, the U.S. economy had expanded over the last 2 quarters due to great consumer spending. So people are still spending money. The economy is still experiencing high velocity, which is only pushing inflation even higher, because inflation thrives off of a very healthy economy. When it is high, when it is out of control, of course. So they basically try to make it seem as if it was actually a good thing, but really, if you understand finances, you'll understand that that's actually bad news, because the Federal Reserve have been doing everything in their power, so-called, to fight against stubborn inflation by increasing interest rates. And since the economy has been, quote, doing very well due to people still spending money in it, that's going to be reasons as to why the Federal Reserve, which is the U.S.'s central bank, will increase interest rates even more. That will guarantee that the economy will fall, as it would say, has it been trying to say over the past 6 months, into a recession, which we're technically in already. But after a recession will come a depression. Okay, because what is a recession? A recession is 2 or more consecutive quarters of negative GDP, and the U.S. had been experiencing more than 2 consecutive quarters already of negative GDP until the last final 2 quarters. So, they'll try to say, oh, well, you see, that proves that we're not in a recession. We'll just look around the world. So, let's listen on.
Of inflation and inflation expectations of a wage price spiral. So we're going to get, first of all, a hard landing. Secondly, this hard landing is not going to be short and shallow, plain vanilla, garden variety, as the markets are now expecting. Before they were hoping for a soft landing, now they say it's going to be a short and shallow recession. But with these amounts of debt in the system, zombie household, corporates, financial institutions, governments, countries, the increase in interest rates is going to create debt crisis and financial stress. It's going to make the recession worse. So damn if you do and damn if you don't, because if the Fed doesn't fight inflation, we're going to have runaway inflation. If they fight it, we'll have an economic crash and a financial crash.
Nouriel, let me jump in here. I mean, do you think that central banks are going to lose this battle to get inflation under control?
Yes, my view is they're going to wimp out and they're going to blink. And the first example was the Bank of England, that, given a reckless fiscal policy, started to print money because interest rates were going to the roof. Same thing is going to happen with the Fed, the European central banks, and other major central banks, because there is so much debt in the system, private and public, that if you fight inflation, not only are you going to have an economic crash, a recession is severe, you're going to have a collapse of financial markets, equity markets, bond markets, credit markets, real estate markets, and the financial crash and the real economic crash are going to feed on each other, that then you're going to have an economic and a financial meltdown.
So how high would you see inflation going? Beyond 8%? How high? Give me a number.
I don't expect hyperinflation. I don't even expect double-digit inflation, but I think that it's mission impossible to go back to 2%. The new normal is going to be something above 5%, below 5% and double digits. Sounds like little, but that the anchoring of inflation expectation is going to cause long-term interest rates to rise very sharply.
There you have it. And it's still possible another rate hike increase of that magnitude come in December. Now, everything that is basically been said here in the readings of this article had been said in the video that we had just seen, so there's no reason for us to read the article. The point is that the Federal Reserve is going to increase interest rates again this Wednesday by 0.75 basis points, and then again in December to so-called fight against stubbornly persisting inflation. Okay, and that's going to cause a lot of layoffs to happen, and that's going to drive the economy into, a depressionary state eventually. Okay, you can now buy 1,200 sneakers for horses. This is vanity. Oprah Winfrey wants, doesn't matter. That does not matter. That's not relevant news. So that pretty much concludes the news from the CNN app. In other news from the RT, Washington seeking to weaken EU, Moscow. Russian Foreign Ministry Sergei Lavrov said U.S. policy is driven by its ideological superiority complexes. The United States is aiming to weaken the EU both militarily and economically. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has claimed Europeans are already suffering from anti-Russian sanctions, many times more than the U.S., he said in an interview published on Sunday. There is a growing number of economists, not only in our country, but also in the West, who come to a conclusion that the U.S. goal is to completely bleed and de-industrialize the European economy, which is true, he said. It is also in Washington's interest to weaken European militarily, to constantly keep it under pressure, to force it to pump weapons into Ukraine, and in return fill the EU's countries' arms depots with American supplies, Lavrov said. They're just basically being used as proxies for the U.S. Okay. In pursuing such a policy, Washington has been guided by economic, purely selfish calculations, as well as by ideological complexes of superiority, he suggested. Earlier this month, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said Americans were making crazy money by selling gas to European states at exorbitant prices against a backdrop of EU sanctions on Russian energy supply. And that's true. Why do you think they blew up the Nord Stream pipelines? He said this would inevitably lead to the deindustrialization of the EU, which in turn will have very, very deplorable consequences for the bloc over the next 10 to 20 years, which we don't have that long, because Scripture says their inward thought is that their houses shall continue forever. The Lord is speeding this thing up for his elect's sake. Okay, we'll be out of here very, very soon, Lord is willing, in no time. In the wake of sweeping sanctions the EU imposed on Russia over its military operations in Ukraine, gas prices have surged. The bloc is now struggling with the prospect of energy shortages in winter and soaring inflation. Brussels has largely followed Washington's stance of seeking to weaken Moscow by imposing sanctions while supporting Kyiv through weapons, supplies, and financial aid, and it's only hurting itself by doing that. And this concludes the article. In other news, most Americans think U.S. is out of control. Inflation came from nowhere. That's bullshit. Food must grow. Ukraine deal chief. U.S. and China discuss bilateral rivalry. India bridge collapse captured on CCTV. Death toll continues to rise. French consumer prices soaring because of inflation. Wheat prices surge on Black Sea grain deal collapse. Airstrikes on critical infrastructure reported across Ukraine. South Korea and U.S. kick off massive air exercises. Germany's inflation worse than expected. U.S. to deploy nuclear-capable bombers to Australia. Ukraine wants U.S. to pressure Israel. Basketball star defends himself following post about anti-you-know-what film. But you can't be against what you inherently are. We are Shemitic. But more specifically, we are Hebrew Israelites. And you small hats, you're Hebrew Edomites. So you are not the true people. Russia tests new nuclear submarine Navy chief. German officials offers controversial solution to gas crisis. For when they shall say what? Peace and safety. Then sudden destruction comes upon them as travail upon a woman with a child, and they should not escape. Ukraine behind drone attack in Crimea. New York Times. LNG ships are waiting for higher EU prices to unload. EU nation issues warning of potential deadly energy disruption. U.S. discussing reduction of Saudi military aid. EU gas prices to remain high for years. These are all headlines in the news, man. So let's get the scriptures and conclude the lesson. This is the book of Ezekiel, chapter 7, verse 25. Destruction cometh, and they shall seek peace, and there shall be none. So when destruction comes in the form of Jacob's trouble, and the judgments that Jacob's trouble will bring, people are going to attempt to seek peace, and there shall be none. Mischief shall come upon mischief, and leading up to Jacob's trouble, and even during Jacob's trouble, there will be mischief upon mischief, bad news after bad news, evils after evils, as the El Ahawad would say. And rumor shall be upon rumor. And then shall they seek a vision of the prophet. But the law shall perish from the priest and counsel from the ancient. So your false prophets won't have the answers to all the problems that's going to be coming down the pipe. Okay, so with that, I pray this lesson was edifying to the elect of the nation of Israel. All praises to Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Bahashem, Archa Kodash, and Shalom to the elect. Lord is willing until the next.